Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Daily Objective. It is July 21st, 2022. I'm Brandon Lisi, curator of the Sharon Historical Society. And today on the Thursday Collective, I'm joined by Dr. Amanda Maxham. And today we are going to talk about the so-called new history of capitalism. And, we have a few things prepared today, and we're really looking forward to what I think will be a good discussion. So welcome, Amanda.
Thank you. All right. So full disclosure, there's a paper I was supposed to read that I didn't. So I'm probably in the same category as our audience. So I'm going to ask helpful questions about what's going on with the new history of capitalism. I didn't know that we needed one.
Yeah, well, to sort of get us right off the bat, I think it's important to define and to sort of articulate what is the new history of capitalism, or it is sometimes abbreviated to NHC. And this is a academic sort of theory that's been put forth by several different books. You have The Empire of Cotton by Sven Beckert, River of Dark Dreams by Walter Johnson, and The Half Has Never Been Told by Edward Baptiste. And these are just a few examples. And they put forth this view about the history of capitalism and the history of slavery. And it's really important to sort of get right, what exactly is being argued here, because as is often the case when you are confronting an opposing viewpoint, it's very easy to straw man that viewpoint. And it's very important to just get clear on what it is. So
yeah, I agree. It's like most of the time when someone has an opposing argument, it's like there's something there. It's like these are smart people. They wrote entire books. There's some reason why they say what it is that they're saying, and it's often a good reason or something that is confusing. So yeah, I agree.
Great. Well, so to just get right into what exactly is being argued here, I'm quoting directly now from Sven Beckert, who, as I mentioned, he's the author of a book called Empire of Cotton. And what is being put forth here, and as he's describing the views of one of his colleagues, Walter Johnson, or at least somebody who also shares this view about the new history of capitalism, Beckert writes, slavery was not just an integral part of American capitalism, but its very essence. And that slavery, and this is sort of quoting a little bit later and sort of summarizing what I see as his perspective, that slavery arose out of and underpinned capitalist development. So I think the view that's being put forth here is that the rise of global capitalism that we see in the 19th century, that really comes out as a result of the fact that you had this massive transatlantic slave trade from, say, the age of the sort of Columbian Exchange and onward. And so this is a movement that I think it's worth noting has come under heavy scrutiny, not just from people, let's say, on the political right, but also on the political left. And it's sort of worth, I think, talking about today why they've received this criticism from what I think are in some cases, their ideological allies. And you can sort of think about this in context of something like the 1619 Project, which is not really focused, I don't think, specifically on the new history of capitalism, or at least not Nicole Hannah-Jones's lead article of the 1619 Project. But that informs, I think, the context of what we're seeing here in terms of this sort of intellectual sort of movement, this underground movement that has gotten a lot of attention in the media, and therefore I think influences how people think about the founders, think about slavery, and think about the rise of capitalism.
Okay, so I want to make sure I've got this right. Okay, so the argument is that capitalism and slavery, like, they go together in some way. So is it that every time you have capitalism, you're also like slavery is going to be a part of it, or that the reason why capitalism came forth as a political idea is because of slavery, or like?
Yeah. So if
make it simple for me, because I'm not quite sure.
Sure.
I want to understand.
And I want to clarify, this is just sort of my view of these writers and my readings of them. And I think it's a worthy discussion to have. And if you have comments about, like, if I'm presenting the view, please, people in the comments, let me know, super chat us. So my understanding is that they view the Southern plantation system that we saw in the United States, and really the sort of the global slave trade, as a form of capitalism. And we can talk about the ways in which they view like capitalism and how does one arrive at a proper conception of capitalism. So they, what was commonly called mercantilism, they call war capitalism. So, and mercantilism, by that I mean the system by which the states of Europe had these sort of like monopoly grants on something like, let's say, the East India Trade Company, and essentially state and economics were completely aligned. They call that capitalism. And so they sort of view the slave trade and everything that happened with there as a form of capitalism that ultimately led to the sort of rise of industry in America in the 19th century, and that there was this direct causal relation. So does that clear it up at all?
I guess so. But like, yeah, I think it's important for me to try to be clear on what it is that they're saying, and then kind of why they're saying it. Because if I thought about like what is the essence of capitalism, I would say that it's like freedom,
right?
Like that's kind of the foundation. And so for someone to say no, but slavery is actually like that is an example of capitalism, that's a type of capitalism, that like already I'm thinking, okay, well, why would somebody say that? So how are they conceptualizing capitalism? It's just like anytime someone's in the pursuit of like making money, that's capitalism.
Right. It's the loose definition that I think that, or I should say the very broad definition that we see, and I would say an invalid definition that we see used by, I think, most figures in intellectual and just public discourse, that anytime somebody is acquiring wealth or basically building any kind of a mercantile society where there is some form of private property, they call that capitalism. So to kind of pull in a direct quote here from Edward Baptiste, who, as I mentioned at the start, he authored a book called "The Half Has Never Been Told," and he writes, "The ultimate cause of the massive increase in the production of high quality, cheap cotton, an absolute necessity increase if the Western world was to burst out of the 10,000 year Malthusian cycle of agriculture." So in other words, the reason why we were able to transcend from this state where we were sort of like this sort of subsistence farming for all these years, and a big part of their narrative is we had this huge cotton empire in the southern United States, and that ultimately led to an explosion of wealth in their view, but it was completely linked. And I think what they're trying to challenge is what they perceive as the notion in popular discourse that industry and slavery were somehow separate, and that the North had no complicity whatsoever in slavery. And we can talk about sort of the if there's anything valid about that statement.
I mean, I don't know if it's valid or not, but it seems like, yeah, probably not valid. If slavery is happening like right down there and I'm in the same country, it seems like complicity to me.
Yeah. Well, so I think now is a good time to talk about capitalism properly understood and forming a correct concept of what capitalism is and what we mean by capitalism. So, if you go to the essay, "What is Capitalism?" By Ayn Rand, which you can find in Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, she writes, "Capitalism is a social system, a social system based on the recognition of individual rights." So, the way I think one properly conceives of capitalism, it's completely antithetical to the idea that a person could hold somebody else in bondage. And capitalism properly understood cannot coexist with a society where some 1/5 of the whole population doesn't have rights, which was the case for, let's say, the American colonies at the time of the Revolution. Some like 1/5 of the population was enslaved.
Yeah. And it seems like it can't coexist is like not even a strong enough way to put it. It's just like they are not. It's the opposite. It's like it's not that they couldn't be put together. Like you'd have, I don't know, like John and Joe, they don't really get along. It's just like, no, they're completely different species. It doesn't go together. And how sad is it that the history of this country has slavery as part of it? That sucks.
Right. Well, and I think that the sort of elephant in the room that needs to be addressed first, and then we can talk about maybe some of the specifics, is the way in which this theory evades the role of the mind in production and in wealth creation. So in their view, and it's this Marxist perspective that all that is really necessary to create wealth is just muscles, right? That if you just have enough people working, that's what creates wealth. But in fact, what creates wealth is the human mind and great innovation. And there's a quote that I've seen out there that I don't have in front of me, and I'm paraphrasing, but it's from Beckert again, who basically says that, well, it's not about all these gadgets that we created. It's really about that we exploited both land and people. And that's the reason why we saw all the wealth creation that we did in the 19th century.
Huh. Yeah, so that seems, that's interesting. It's a view that, okay, so wealth creation comes from power or muscle or something like that. And I can see how that's plausible, right? Because that's part of it. If you don't have machines or people to do actual work, then nothing gets built, nothing happens. But like you said, it's sort of not the essence of it. You can have all the muscle power, raw muscle power in the world, but who's going to direct it? What are these people going to do? And I should talk about the super chat. So there's a couple. We have Mark Moses, $5. It says used to expedite the resolution of your technical difficulties. Am I having technical difficulties?
No, I think they meant that we started late.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry about that. Thank you for the $5 though. And Mary Eileen says this is to celebrate the resolving of the technical difficulties. Awesome. Thank you, Mary Eileen. And another $5 from Mary Eileen. She's asking, where does the cotton gin fit in, and was it beneficial to slaves? So this is okay. So I will give you, I had a horrible history education, was filling out worksheets. I thought history was I don't know, the most boring thing in the world, or just something to memorize, which is a horrible, horrible tragedy, because I've learned now that no, history is actually really, really interesting. It's the story of people. And what could be actually more interesting than that? So what have I learned? What did I learn about the cotton gin in school? Yeah, I learned that it was an invention that that helped, I guess, slaves to process cotton more quickly. And so you can see, yeah, I guess that sounds like a machine to help you do work sounds good, but then it's in the context of slavery. So is that really helpful to give someone who's not free? Here's a great tool to help you. I don't know. Yeah. So what do you think?
One thing I can just say quickly about the cotton gin is that a lot of theorists, and I wanted to talk about this because I think it's really the essence of the issue. A lot of theorists at the time of the revolution thought that slavery would die a slow death, that a gradual death, and that it would eventually be over, in part because, a lot of American theorists did sort of recognize the fact that when you have a free labor force that is actually motivated by their own self-interest, that is far superior to somebody who has a gun to their head or a whip to their back. But in fact, the invention of the cotton gin makes the process of processing raw cotton much easier, and therefore that became a reason to increase production by a huge magnitude, and therefore these slaves are now being overworked to an incredible degree, far more than before the invention of the cotton gin. So it is a device that really enables the continuation of this institution, or one of the things that helps enable the continuation of slavery, at least in part.
That's yeah, okay. And so that's a real tragedy too, because usually I think of technology as that's something to celebrate. Someone invents the horseless carriage. Oh my gosh, that's amazing. Someone invents a machine to make farming more easier and more efficient. That's generally something that you should say, great. But then you put it in this context of slavery and the lack of freedom, and then it becomes something evil. That's horrible. That kind of reminds me of the Soviet Union. I don't know. I've seen pictures from there of the Kremlin. It's this beautiful building where they're their subway system, and it's this wonderful thing. And I guess that's what, cheap slave labor buys you. But yeah, it's in the context of people doing evil things and using technology for evil versus good. It's not cool.
And it certainly could have been, I think, a positive development, but in the context of a predominantly enslaved society in the American South, it certainly was not, I don't think, a positive for any enslaved person living at that time. But with the time that we have, I just want to address, I think, what is probably like one of the most important issues here, which is, how do we conceive of capitalism and the American Revolution and sort of like the sort of increase in freedom, especially in the Western world, from the time of the Revolution, the American Revolution, into the 19th century. And I want to argue that fundamentally the American Revolution and the rise of global capitalism was fundamentally an anti-slavery movement, even though the founders themselves did not succeed in abolishing slavery. So one piece of information that I think is really critical to keep in mind is that before the 1760s, there were very few people who questioned the moral status of slavery. And it actually comes as a surprise to most people, though, that if you read the writings of American revolutionary leaders, and by that I mean all the people who signed the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, even though many of them were slave owners themselves, there was not a single revolutionary leader who ever publicly praised slavery as a positive good. And that is in direct contrast to, let's say, what we saw in like the 1830s in the generation of, say, John C. Calhoun and the people actually making the moral argument for slavery when they were confronted by the direct sort of abolitionist argument. But
okay, so they're not saying that it's bad. They're not coming out and saying, yeah, maybe we should start thinking about the moral status of slaves and whether that's a good thing. But they're also they're not coming out and saying this is publicly and saying slavery is good. This is why it should be part of America.
Well, I'll just clarify that. Well, many of them do say that it's bad very explicitly. And in fact, the first political act against slavery ever in history comes in 1774 when the Continental Congress encourages the colonies to end the international slave trade. So that right away, I think, runs contrary to the sort of narratives that, let's say, the new history of capitalism is trying to identify. Because simply put, they're saying that, the history of capitalism, the sort of rise of this sort of rights-based kind of society, that is linked with slavery, but in fact, they are working against it. And even the people who owned slaves and, had huge plantations, like, let's say, George Washington, this is a quote that I have from him. He says, "There is not a man living who wishes more sincerely than I do to see a plan adopted for the abolition of slavery." And you can see this kind of sentiment echoed by other slave owners like Patrick Henry, Thomas Jefferson. So what I think this speaks to is the fact that as slave owners, we can question and maybe probe at their moral character, and definitely say that we can doubt certain aspects of their character because of the fact that they were slave owners. But the fact that they were espousing these ideas that become the foundation for the argument against slavery internationally. That is really their major contribution to political thought, and what I think gives rise to the sort of the great movements of, say, like after 1776. And for those who don't know, 1776 is not just the year that the Declaration of Independence is signed, but it's the first commercial use of the Watt steam engine. And Adam Smith publishes The Wealth of Nations. So in 1 year, we get all of these sort of the principles of capitalism, or at least in its prototypical form, and the sort of the rights of man expressed to the world. And it's no surprise then that in 1775, we see the establishment of the first anti-slavery society in history in Philadelphia.
Okay, so you're saying there's 3 cool inventions in 1776? One is the invention of America. The second is the steam engine. And then what the third is, Adam Smith is like
The Wealth of Nations. Yeah, his argument. Okay. And certainly, like I said, it's certainly not like the argument that Ayn Rand makes for capitalism, but it is, I think, a necessary sort of development in sort of the rise of freedom and sort of the freedom in markets and separation of state and economics. And I want to emphasize, because I think this is one part of the story that they often accuse people like us of leaving out, and that's sort of the role of like what were enslaved people thinking at this time, and that's important to really bring in here. So the American Revolution and the principles that they're espousing has a tremendous impact on people who are enslaved living in the colonies. And one of the examples that really comes to my mind is that of a woman named Elizabeth Freeman, who was actually born into slavery in New York in 1744, eventually came to Massachusetts. And in 1780, the Massachusetts Constitution basically expressed the principles that all men are born free and equal. And Elizabeth Freeman she didn't know how to read, but she had heard somebody reciting the 1780 Massachusetts Constitution. And she went to the person who, her enslaver, and she said, "I heard that paper read yesterday." This is what she's allegedly quoted as saying. "I heard that paper yesterday that says all men are created equal and that every man has a right to freedom. Won't the law give me my freedom?" And then that becomes the basis upon which a lot of petitions from enslaved peoples are able to successfully argue that they should be emancipated. And in fact, Elizabeth Freeman is one of those people who is able to acquire her freedom after having heard the arguments made in the 1780 Massachusetts Constitution. And this is not the only case. I mean, you look at Frederick Douglass, who called the Declaration of Independence the ring bolt to the chain of your nation's destiny. The principles contained in that instrument are saving principles. So it really gives this powerful moral argument to enslaved peoples upon which they are able to successfully argue for their emancipation, and ultimately leads to the end of slavery. And that's the argument that Lincoln uses in, say, like if you read the Gettysburg Address.
Can you say that ring bolt thing again? That sounded really interesting, but
yeah. So the full quote is, he says, "I have said that the Declaration of Independence is the ring bolt to the chain of your nation's destiny. So indeed, I regard it. The principles contained in that instrument are saving principles." And he writes this in his work with to "What is the 4th of July to a Slave?" or I believe that's the title.
Wow, ring bolt. That's interesting. Okay, so I'm going to go through a couple more super chats here. Jonathan Honig is $4.99. Thank you, Jonathan. Enric is $4.99. He says the rise of capitalism was a transition from agrarian to industrial society. Slavery was a holdover of the agrarian society. So what do you think about that?
I think that there is some truth to the fact that since time immemorial, I mean, force had been the standard by which men dealt with one another. I think what's the quote from Francisco d'Anconia where he said, "Blood, whips, or guns, or dollars. Take your pick. There is no other." Right. So there is some truth to the fact that there is no, simply until we had a capitalist society, there was no argument for, men can live with each other without resorting to force. In the words of Thomas Hobbes, life was short, nasty, brutish, and short.
Yeah.
But I want to caution just really quickly, because there's an argument that actually Hegel makes that gets picked up by many of the American intellectuals in the 1830s and American politicians in the 1830s, that basically says, we have to bring civilization to these uncivilized people, and a transitory state in that process is to enslave them. And I want to just caution, because I think that's an argument advanced by the enslavers in the antebellum period. And, it sort of treats history as like, we go through these sort of transitions and everything is sort of inevitable. And I don't think history works that way at all. It's a history of individuals, not of sort of collective elements that are going through this sort of process together.
Yeah, makes sense. Roland Horvath, I think that's €4.99. I don't know what a euro pence is.
It looks like the euro symbol to me, right?
Okay, so I found history, I found history boring in school myself and became interested in it when I was liberated from school. Awesome. Yeah, me too. I feel like this is one of life's tragedies that I had such a horrible history education, and that it actually is really a fascinating subject. Nathan Smith, $5. I've heard that the North was financially much stronger than the South. Is this true? And how would advocates of the new history explain this?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I think that we should definitely get into some of the things that are like the outright errors and misrepresentations that are contained in these writings that I've been mentioning. So to directly address this question, yes, the North was much financially stronger. But just to give you a sense of what the argument is from the new history of capitalism sort of writers, is that sort of production, the increase, is a result of the fact that you had the American South, producing all the cotton that, say, the Industrial Revolution needed, and that they never would have been able to get started if they didn't have this sort of enslaved economy. But what that view evades, in my estimation, is that the Industrial Revolution in, let's say, Europe had gotten started well before, decades before the cotton gin had been invented, and you saw this explosion in American cotton production. And what you'll also notice, if you let's see, I have a little statistic here that I think is meaningful. The highest level of output for cotton was actually doubled in 1891. The U.S. cotton output was twice the highest level ever achieved before the war in 1891. So in a society without slaves, cotton production actually increased. So that would, I think, counter the argument that somehow industrialization necessitates exploitation and slaves. And one of the other things too that they get wrong is that they say, well, the whole westward expansion of the United States was all driven by cotton production. So there's a line from Beckert where he says, this is a direct quote from him. He says, by 1850, 67% of U.S. cotton grew on land that had not been part of the country 50 years earlier. So in 1800. But if you look at the actual statistics from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the states and territories after 1800 accounted for less than 15% of American cotton in 1850. So his numbers are just completely mistaken. And if you're curious, if anyone here is curious about the specific, the multitude of errors that you can see contained within these, and just misuse and abuse and outright lies in terms of the statistical information, there's an article by Alan Olmsted and Paul Rode called "Cotton, Slavery, and the New History of Capitalism." I purchased the article, and you can probably find it in a few different places, but the title again, "Cotton, Slavery, New History of Capitalism," really goes through each of the three books that I mentioned at the start of the episode, and really kind of gives you in detail all the various sort of errors that were made.
Okay, so I want to talk about the game of history, because I feel like I'm putting the pieces together, but again, my history education was so poor. So basically what's going on here is that you've got some view that's being put forth, something about the relationship of capitalism and slavery, and how the slavery is like an example of capitalism, or how it was an integral part of it. You couldn't have had one without the other. Anyway, so part of the game is to get clear on what the viewpoint is. But then you're bringing in all these facts and figures and thinking about what people said at the time, what people thought at the time, and you're trying to put that together in order to what? What are we trying to do here?
Well, I think this is a fundamental, I think, perspective of how do we view, in fundamental terms, the American Revolution and capitalism in general. That the capitalism that sprung out of, let's say, the English-speaking world in the 19th century, and they want to attribute, and by they I mean the new history of capitalism historians want to attribute this sort of rise of production to the fact that we had slaves. And what I would argue is that they didn't have to have slaves, and that certainly force and mind are opposites. And if anything, it curtails the kind of production that you could have had if the economy was free and you didn't have any enslaved peoples. And I think that's evidenced by the fact that after the Civil War, you saw a far greater explosion in productivity after we had sort of gotten to a point where certainly there was still a great deal of injustice, and we can certainly talk about that. But certainly nothing on the level of chattel slavery in the antebellum period. And the late 19th century saw this incredible explosion and sort of into the 20th century. So the non-enslaved society is really, I think, that's what leads to greater prosperity. And I think the historical record shows that.
So I want to ask a question that, I don't want it to seem mean, but
No, go ahead.
Okay, so this is all stuff that happened in the past, right? And okay, I get that some people nerd out on it and they're really interested in I see historical stuff looks like behind you and that kind of thing. But why does it matter? Why does it matter that we get the right that we put it together in the right way? Why is that important, considering that's over?
I think that's a really great question. And I think the answer is we're still fighting for individual rights. We're still fighting for the principles that were espoused in 1776. And I don't think that they properly understood them in the time that they were written, in terms of what individual rights meant, in terms of like how, how people live their lives and their proper relationship to the government. And we're still trying to bring that fully to fruition. And so we have a choice. We can either look back and say, well, I reject the Declaration and the Constitution and all the work that the founders did, or we can say we are working and building upon what they've done, which I think is really, for our purposes, really important, because the fight for individual rights is not over, even though, we now have the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, which ended slavery, at least in its most horrific form, in the form of chattel slavery. We're still, continuing this battle to this day. And I think Ayn Rand is really the culmination of all of that. She basically takes the best of the Enlightenment thinkers and takes it to a new age. And that's really the sort of the struggle that lies ahead.
Okay. So what you're saying is like, it really is like the story of people, and that you want to get the right lesson out of it so that you know what to do moving forward. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. I think that there's an important lesson here about the value of freedom and the fact that, this is a clear example, I think, of demonstrating how force and mind are opposites. But it's also really pertains to how do we conceptualize of our history? Is it something worth celebrating and looking for in terms of, okay, is this something that, we can draw inspiration from in terms of where we go in the future? Or should we go out in the street and tear down statues of Thomas Jefferson and George Washington?
So what do you honestly think? I mean, so slavery was part of our history. So how do we celebrate with like, a full heart given that?
Well, I mean, I think like I said, I mean, it's something where we can certainly critique, I think, the moral character of those people that own slaves. I think that's, like appropriate given the fact that, I mean, they held other people in bondage. But nevertheless, how do we think of, like the impact of the American Revolution? Both, through the revolutionary period, there were people who believed that slavery was just a part of, what was. But now, after the American Revolution, we have this solid moral foundation to argue for rights. And then that, it enables, a lot of formerly enslaved people to make the argument for their own emancipation. And that should be celebrated. The fact that they laid the moral foundation for individual rights for the first time in history in 1776. And that gives us the possibility for our further liberation from the arbitrary use of force, from coercion at the hands of our government.
Yeah, that's kind of cool. That it's like they planted a seed that grew into something so powerful that it was able to, like, I don't know, like uproot itself, and to change what was unjust about this, the soil that it was planted in. And
here's what I think is sort of the legacy and what really should be celebrated. So like in 1810, for instance, you had, I mean, from the time of the revolution through 1810, you had more than 100,000 formerly enslaved peoples emancipated through one means of another, whether that was court cases or, a voluntary manumission or actual legislation in some cases. But this was the largest emancipation of slaves in world history. And we often don't think about it like that. I mean, I do think that, the history of America is they basically came out with these extremely radical principles, and that we should conceive of American history as living up to those principles. And I like the analogy you used, that they planted a seed, and then it took, great students of the founders like Abraham Lincoln and hopefully others like that in the future to really sort of like bring those principles to full fruition to the extent that the founders may not have recognized. So I think it's totally fair to have this sort of nuanced perspective on the American founders, but still look at their ideas as immensely heroic, and we should be immensely grateful for, I think, the work that they did and the foundation they laid.
Yeah, that's cool. There's someone here named Michael Lisi giving us 1999.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Yeah, anything you want to add? I think we're going to head over to Clubhouse.
Yeah. So please do join us on Clubhouse. I think that, we've really just scratched the surface of what we can talk about. So please bring your questions with you over to Clubhouse if you have any. I'm happy to, stick around and talk about these issues because, it is, I think, deeply important. And hopefully, if any of you are still maybe unconvinced about the importance of history and what it can teach us, I hope to convince you in our next session. So thank you, Amanda. I appreciate you being here and asking some really great questions, and to our super chatters for asking some great questions. So
yeah, thank you to everyone. And yeah, Brandon, I'm like super excited to pick your brain about history because it's something that's missing in my life, and I'd like to know more about it, and particularly why it's so cool and why you're so excited about it. So
well, I'm happy to oblige. That's great. All right. Well, I guess this is us signing off, and see you all very shortly, maybe just in a minute or so on Clubhouse.
Bye-bye.
All right. Bye now.